This begins a series of videos on Ezra and Nehemiah, new beginnings after the exile. A little bit of historical backdrop to Ezra and Nehemiah. Jews went into exile. They went at various times. Some went as early as 605 BC, when after the Battle of Carchemish, that Daniel and his friends went into exile. Some go into exile with King Jehoiachin in 598-597. Many more go into exile after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. And there's, by the way, various ways of counting Jeremiah's 70-year Babylonian captivity. But the exile was about, the Babylonian period was about 66 years. And those that went into exile were told by Jeremiah that they'd be there for a lifetime. Not all Jews were exiled, some to Babylon anyway. Some fled to Egypt. Jeremiah ended up in Egypt at the end of his life. Some stayed, though life was hard and Jews in Palestine didn't flourish. Probably more stayed than went, actually. But the ones exiled were the leaders, were the upper classes, were the craftsmen. And those that stayed faced a very difficult situation. So over time, there's going to be more Jews outside of Palestine than there are Jews that are there. Effects of this exile on Jews. It's the beginning of the diaspora, where you have many Jews that are outside the land, which remains true to this day. They also adopted a new language, Aramaic. Parts of Ezra are in Aramaic. Parts of the book of Daniel are in Aramaic. Words of Jesus in the New Testament are sometimes in Aramaic. And later on, Jews will adopt Aramaic in their religious document, the Babylonian Talmud. It's mostly in Aramaic. In exile, they will learn new forms of worship. It's only probably about the 2nd century that they start having synagogues. Before that, they didn't exist. They're going to emphasize the law a lot more. Having gone into exile because of not obeying the law, they became much more meticulous, maybe excessively so, in following the law. It did help weed out polytheism. Basically, the Jews in exile that were polytheists assimilated to the pagan population and ceased to be Jews. So the ones that remained self-identified as Jews were not polytheists after a while. And, of course, the canonization of Scripture takes place sometime during the exile, too, for the Old Testament. Well, let's talk about the return from exile in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. A little bit of introduction to Ezra and Nehemiah. The book of Ezra is named after the main character, Ezra, who's found in chapters 7 through 10. The book of Nehemiah is named after its main character, Nehemiah. Now, in the Septuagint, the apocryphal Ezra is labeled First Esdras, and our book of Ezra, the canonical Ezra, and Nehemiah occur and are labeled Second Esdras. So they combine together, Ezra and Nehemiah, but listed after the apocryphal First Esdras. Now, in ancient times, Ezra and Nehemiah were considered one book. The Hebrew Bible has no break between Ezra and Nehemiah and count them as one. The Masoretes give a verse count. They always counted all the verses in each book, and when they counted all the verses, they combine the verses of Ezra and Nehemiah and list that number at the end of Nehemiah. Josephus, in his Against Appian, Contra Appian, which we talked about in the canon of the Old Testament, assumes Ezra and Nehemiah would count as one book, and the Talmud regarded the two books as one, with even proposing that Ezra was the author. And again, as we saw, both books are combined and called Second Esdras in the Septuagint. Well, how were the books, how'd they come to be divided? Well, the early church father, Origen, divided the two books. So did Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate. There is some internal evidence that suggests that perhaps the books circulated separately. Gleason Archer points out that there's a almost identical list in Ezra 2 and Ezra 7, and it's difficult to imagine why there would be two identical lists in the same original work. So here are the views of authorship that are possible. One view of the authorship of Ezra and Nehemiah is that Ezra wrote Ezra and Nehemiah. This was the view of some rabbis mentioned in the Talmud, Baba Bathra 15a. It was adopted in relatively modern times by William F. Albright, wrote an article, The Date and Personality of the Chronicler, who argued that Ezra also wrote chronicles, just thus combining this view with the standard critical view that we'll talk about in a moment. There's some evidence in favor of this view that Ezra was the author-editor of the whole work. He writes in first person about himself in verses 7 through 9, in chapters 7 through 9 of Ezra. And Ezra overlaps with Nehemiah. According to Nehemiah 8, he was there when they read the law to the people, and so he could have edited the final work. On the other hand, against it is that it doesn't explain the third-person narrations about what Ezra did at certain points. And moreover, Nehemiah speaks in first person in the book of Nehemiah quite a bit. In fact, he speaks in first person more than Ezra does in the book of Ezra. A second possibility is that Ezra wrote Ezra and Nehemiah wrote Nehemiah, something you might suppose from the English Bible. R.K. Harrison tried to defend that view. Ezra could well have edited Ezra, including his own first-person memoir of chapters 6 through 9, but then he supplemented that with a third-person narration about other persons. And then Nehemiah is largely written in first person, especially chapters 1 through 7, but then there's some first-person narration in chapter 12 and chapter 13. And so perhaps Nehemiah took his own autobiography, supplemented it with some other materials, and that's how Nehemiah came about. And if you adopt this view, it would account for some of the differences of perceived style between the two books. But there's problems with the view that Ezra wrote Ezra and Nehemiah wrote Nehemiah. Ezra 8 is about Ezra and Nehemiah, but it's all in third person. And if Nehemiah wrote that, why did he write about himself in third person? And also, there's evidence that the date of the book as a whole, at least Nehemiah, is around 400 BC. Nehemiah 12 verses 10 through 11 takes the lineage of the high priests down to Jaddua in the late 5th or early 4th century. And this is likely later than either Ezra or Nehemiah lived. So this brings us to the third view, and this is a view that a narrator, who may be the chronicler, edited Ezra and Nehemiah. This I would call the common critical view, as most critical scholars hold to this view. It's clear that there are sources in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. There is an autobiographical account that appears to have been written by Ezra, which we can label the Ezra memoir. That's in Ezra chapter 6 through 9. But then there's a autobiographical account of Nehemiah, which presumably was written by Nehemiah, Nehemiah chapters 1 through 7, and then you have some verses in chapters 12 and most of chapter 13. That would be first-person narrative of Nehemiah. We could call that the Nehemiah memoir. Couple of other sources are clear. There are letters to and from Persian kings. A decree of Cyrus in Ezra chapter 1, an Aramaic from Rahum and Shimshai and others to Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes' reply in Ezra chapter 4, a letter in Aramaic from Tatenai to Darius, and Darius' reply in Ezra chapter 5 and chapter 6, and all these letters and decrees would have existed independently of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah when they were first composed. And so they've obviously been used as sources to write Ezra and Nehemiah. There are also lists of various sorts, inventory of temple items, list of people that returned from exile, list of those returning with Ezra, a list of those who had married foreign women, a wall builders list, a family heads in Jerusalem list, county towns with Jewish populations list, priests and Levites from the time of Zerubbabel list, high priests from Joshua to Yehuda, priests and Levites from the time of Jehoiakim, a whole bunch of different lists. And again, those lists very likely existed independently before being incorporated into the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so it seems likely, and this critical view is a view that I actually find attractive, that Ezra Nehemiah is a single edited work, and that the person ultimately responsible for it is the narrator, the editor, though he incorporated autobiographical memoirs of Ezra and Nehemiah. He incorporated letters to and from Persian kings, and he incorporated into his work also lists of various things that he considered important. Now the question is, was this editor, narrator, the chronicler? Well, evidence in favor of it is 2 Chronicles 36, verses 22 and 23, compared with Ezra chapter 1, 1 through 4. It turns out those are word for word identical. And so it may be a catch line to say the end of Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra is going from one work to its sequel, written by the same editor. McConville, in any case, correctly observes that whether or not the chronicler is the author of Ezra and Nehemiah, the two works are clearly related. And in any case, Ezra and Nehemiah is to be regarded as the sequel of the books of Chronicles. Evidence against Ezra and Nehemiah being the work of the chronicler, there are differences in styles that Williamson sees in Chronicles as compared with Ezra and Nehemiah. He still sees an editor involved in Ezra and Nehemiah, but doesn't think it's the chronicler. And the Hebrew canon places Ezra and Nehemiah before Chronicles, as if it's not a single work by a single editor. Though, on the other hand, the English Bible does place Ezra and Nehemiah after Chronicles. So I would adopt the critical view, and we'll continue this discussion in the next lecture, next video.